Long before the world knew it by any name, before maps attempted to divide it, before languages were written to describe it, the land that would become Igbo-Ukwu already existed in a state of deep, slow, breathing continuity. It was not empty. It was not waiting. It was not a blank space waiting for human meaning to be written upon it. It was already full of processes, cycles, rhythms, and life forms that had been negotiating existence for thousands of years without interruption. The forests were not just vegetation but layered systems of survival, where light struggled to reach the ground and where every shadow seemed to hold movement. Rain did not fall as an event, it arrived as part of a permanent agreement between sky and earth, returning again and again until everything became saturated with humidity, fertility, and decay. In this landscape, what is now known as Igbo-Ukwu existed as part of a broader ecological and cultural zone that supported early human settlement long before any form of centralized political organization emerged. The people who lived here did not think of themselves as part of a civilization in the way that later historians would define the term. They were embedded in something more immediate, more intimate, and more demanding, survival tied directly to land, ancestry, and spiritual balance. Their settlements were not cities. There were no streets laid out in geometric order, no monumental architecture rising to signal dominance over the environment, no kings issuing commands from elevated thrones. Instead, life was arranged in compounds that followed kinship lines, where extended families lived together in clusters that mirrored the structure of ancestry itself. Each compound was a world in miniature, containing living quarters, cooking spaces, storage pits, and sacred corners where shrines to ancestors or local spirits were quietly maintained. Time in this world did not move in the linear, mechanical way modern societies often assume. Instead, it moved in cycles tied to agriculture, ritual, and memory. The planting of yam was not merely an economic act but a deeply symbolic engagement with life itself. Yam represented masculinity, stability, and continuity. Its cultivation required not only physical labor but moral and spiritual readiness. To plant yam successfully was to demonstrate harmony with both the land and the unseen forces believed to govern fertility. Harvests were not just seasonal events, they were communal validations that the world remained in balance. But beneath this agricultural rhythm lay something even more fundamental, a worldview in which the visible and invisible worlds were inseparable. In this understanding, reality was layered. The physical world that people could touch, see, and manipulate was only one layer. Beneath it and around it existed a second order of reality populated by ancestors, spirits, forces of nature, and beings whose influence was constant even if their presence was not always visible. This belief system shaped everything. A tree was never just a tree, it could be a dwelling place for forces that demanded respect. A river was not only a source of water, it could carry spiritual significance, capable of blessing or harming depending on how it was approached. Even objects created by human hands could acquire meaning beyond their physical form. Clay pots, carved wood, and later metal objects were not inert materials, they were potential vessels of power, intention, and identity. Within this framework, human beings were not seen as separate from nature, nor as its masters. They were participants in a vast, interconnected system where every action had consequences that extended beyond immediate perception. This is why ritual was not an occasional activity but a constant feature of life. Rituals were not theatrical performances, they were necessary negotiations with forces that sustained existence. Over time, within this long-standing system, subtle transformations began to occur. There was no single moment of revolution, no clear break that historians could point to as the beginning of change. Instead, what emerged was a slow intensification of complexity within certain parts of the region. In the area that would eventually become known as Igbo-Ukwu, something began to concentrate, not power in the political sense, but influence rooted in ritual authority and specialized knowledge. Certain individuals became recognized not because they commanded armies or controlled territories, but because they appeared to understand the hidden dimensions of reality more deeply than others. These individuals acted as intermediaries between the human community and the spiritual forces believed to govern fertility, health, fortune, and misfortune. Their authority was not imposed, it was acknowledged. People sought them out voluntarily, bringing questions, problems, and offerings in exchange for guidance. And within this slow unfolding transformation, the foundations of what would later be identified as Igbo-Ukwu were quietly being laid, not as a kingdom, not as an empire, but as a deeply specialized cultural and ritual environment where meaning, material, and spirituality were becoming increasingly intertwined. No one living in that time could have known that what they were building would one day be buried, forgotten, and later rediscovered as one of the most important archaeological revelations in African history. To them, it was simply life, continuous, complex, and deeply embedded in a world where the seen and unseen were always in conversation. And yet, beneath the soil they walked on, beneath the compounds where they slept and worked, beneath the forests that surrounded their lives, the conditions for something extraordinary were quietly forming. Something that would one day astonish the world. In the same land where forests pressed closely against human settlements and where life moved in cycles shaped by yam cultivation, ancestry, and spirit reverence, a quiet but irreversible transformation began to unfold. It did not arrive as an announcement. There were no sudden proclamations, no wars that marked a new order, no dramatic collapse of the old ways. Instead, it entered slowly, almost imperceptibly, through the most ordinary yet most dangerous element known to human life, fire. Fire had always been part of existence in this region. It cooked food, cleared land for farming, provided warmth during rains, and hardened clay into vessels strong enough to store water and grain. But over time, fire ceased to be only a servant of necessity. It became something that certain individuals began to observe with unusual attention, as if its behavior contained hidden logic waiting to be understood. In the compounds that would later be associated with Igbo-Ukwu, there emerged people who did not merely use fire but studied it through repeated engagement, learning its moods, its thresholds, and its capacity to transform matter in ways that bordered on the miraculous. It is here that metallurgy begins, not as an industry, but as an unfolding discovery. At first, iron may have been worked in simple forms, shaped into tools through hammering and heating. But copper and bronze introduced something entirely different. Unlike stone or wood, metal could change state. It could soften, melt, flow like liquid, and then solidify again into permanent form. This behavior must have appeared deeply significant to people whose worldview already recognized transformation as a spiritual principle. In a culture where existence itself was understood as a continuous negotiation between visible and invisible forces, metal seemed to embody transition in its purest form. Within this context, a breakthrough occurred that would later define Igbo-Ukwu's archaeological identity, the mastery of lost wax casting. But to describe it merely as a technique is to miss its cultural depth. It was not simply a method of production, it was a controlled ritual of transformation, requiring patience, precision, and a deep understanding of materials that could not be rushed or corrected once set in motion. As this technological mastery developed, something else began to shift within the society itself. Certain compounds or households began to specialize not only in agriculture but in craft production. This is where Igbo-Ukwu begins to emerge not as a simple settlement but as a specialized cultural node. It functioned as a place where ritual authority, technological mastery, and symbolic production converged. Objects produced here were not just used locally, they accumulated meaning and value that extended beyond immediate practical function. Within this growing complexity, material wealth began to take on new forms. Beads, for instance, became increasingly significant. Some were locally made, but others were clearly not. Their materials and chemical compositions suggest long-distance movement through trade networks that extended far beyond the forest regions of southeastern Nigeria. These beads, made of glass, carnelian, and other exotic materials, did not arrive through direct travel from distant civilizations. Instead, they moved through long chains of exchange, passing through multiple intermediaries before reaching Igbo-Ukwu. However, what is most important is participation in a system of value exchange that extended across vast distances. By the time the society surrounding Igbo-Ukwu reached the height of its cultural expression, something fundamental had changed in the way people understood the world around them. Objects were no longer simply objects. In earlier generations, a vessel could hold water, a bead could decorate the body, and a crafted object could serve a clear, practical purpose. But now, these same items had absorbed layers of significance that could not be reduced to function alone. A bronze vessel was not merely shaped metal, it was a record of transformation, earth turned into liquid fire, then into something permanent. A bead was not just an ornament, it was a fragment of a journey, a sign of connection to places far beyond immediate experience, and a marker of status within a system that valued accumulation of meaning as much as accumulation of material. This transformation did not occur suddenly. It emerged gradually as ritual practices deepened and as certain individuals gained recognition for their ability to interpret and manage the unseen forces believed to influence life. These individuals did not rule in the way kings would in later centralized societies. Their authority was quieter, but no less powerful. It came from knowledge of how to perform rituals, how to communicate with ancestors, and how to maintain balance between worlds. Within this system, objects became tools of communication. They were used in rituals not because they were beautiful, but because they were believed to carry power. The process of creating them, especially in the case of bronze casting, was itself transformative, involving fire, timing, and precision that seemed almost beyond ordinary human control. This gave such objects an aura that extended beyond their physical form. As this worldview matured, it began to shape one of the most important moments in human experience, death. In Igbo-Ukwu, death was not understood as an ending. It was understood as movement. A transition from one form of presence to another. The boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a threshold, one that required careful management to cross successfully. If this transition was not handled properly, imbalance could occur, affecting not only the deceased but the living community as well. Because of this, burial was not a simple act. It was a carefully structured process, guided by those who understood its significance. And when a person of high status died, this process became even more elaborate, not because of wealth alone, but because of the role that individual had played within the spiritual and social structure of the community. The preparation began before the burial itself. The body was not treated as something to be removed, but as something to be transformed. It was positioned with care, sometimes adorned, sometimes accompanied by items that had defined the person's identity in life. But what made Igbo-Ukwu extraordinary was not the treatment of the body alone. It was the scale and intentionality of what surrounded it. Objects were selected, not randomly, but deliberately. In this context, the person being buried did not disappear. They were repositioned. They continued to exist, but in a different form, within a different layer of reality. The objects placed with them were not left behind. They were carried forward, serving functions that extended beyond physical use. This reveals something essential about Igbo-Ukwu society. Objects were not valued simply because they were rare or difficult to obtain. They were valued because of what they represented, what they connected, and what they could do within a system that understood reality as layered and relational. A bronze vessel connected earth, fire, and human intention. A bead connected distant lands, trade networks, and social identity. A burial connected life, death, and continuity. Everything was part of a larger pattern. And in this pattern, nothing existed alone. The extraordinary richness of these burial contexts, what modern archaeologists would later uncover and study, does not represent excess. It represents a society that had developed a highly refined understanding of how to use material culture to express and manage the most important transitions in human existence. But there is also something else present in these burials, something more subtle. They represent a moment of peak intensity. A point at which the systems of meaning, craftsmanship, trade, and ritual had all converged at their highest level. The complexity seen in these burial contexts suggests that Igbo-Ukwu had reached a stage where its cultural expressions were fully developed, fully integrated, and deeply embedded in every aspect of life. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world that had created such extraordinary expressions began to change. The objects remained. The meanings that shaped them began to transform. And the civilization that had once given them life moved, quietly, toward a different future. Eventually, the memory of its earlier intensity faded even within local historical consciousness. Without written records, monumental architecture, or continuous external documentation, the extraordinary period of Igbo-Ukwu's cultural peak slipped beyond living memory. What remained was continuity of settlement, but not continuity of recognition. And beneath the soil, the objects that had once carried such profound meaning remained undisturbed, sealed within burial contexts and hidden deposits, waiting for a future that none of their creators could have imagined. A future in which the earth itself would return them to human awareness. After the slow transformation, the world of Igbo-Ukwu entered a period that is almost impossible to reconstruct from memory alone. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was no longer recorded in ways that survived time. The society did not collapse in fire or war, and it did not vanish in a dramatic disappearance. Instead, it passed into something far more difficult to interpret: continuity without visibility. Life remained in the region. People continued to live on the land, cultivate crops, build compounds, raise families, and maintain spiritual relationships with ancestors. The forest did not reclaim everything in a single motion, it remained a living environment shared between humans and nature. But the extraordinary cultural intensity that had once produced the dense archaeological signatures of bronze casting, bead accumulation, and ritual burials no longer existed in the same concentrated form. What this means is that Igbo-Ukwu did not become a ruin in the classical sense. It became something quieter, a lived landscape where history no longer announced itself through large material expressions. Over generations, the memory of earlier cultural phases gradually weakened. Oral traditions, if they preserved echoes of that past at all, transformed it into fragments of story, symbolism, and ancestral reference that no longer pointed clearly to the specific world that had once existed beneath the soil. The extraordinary metal objects, the vast bead assemblages, and the complex burial systems were no longer part of active cultural production. They remained underground, physically present but socially invisible. Centuries passed in this state of quiet continuity. Generations were born, lived, and died without awareness of the full depth of what lay beneath them. The soil itself became the archive, holding within it the preserved remains of a world that had once been intensely active but was now completely hidden from human perception. The most striking feature of this long period is not change, but stability. The land remained inhabited. The cultural identity of the people remained continuous in broad terms. But the specific historical peak that archaeologists would later identify as Igbo-Ukwu's unique cultural fluorescence existed entirely outside living memory. It had not been erased, it had simply been folded into the deep time of the landscape. The moment the buried world of Igbo-Ukwu began to reappear, it did not announce itself as history. It returned as confusion. At first, what came out of the ground did not look like part of a coherent civilization. It looked like fragments, strange metallic forms, unfamiliar shapes, and objects whose purpose was not immediately understandable. People who encountered them during digging did not have the language to explain what they were seeing. The objects did not fit into known categories of tools, weapons, or everyday items familiar to later communities in the region. They were too intricate, too unusual, too deliberately designed for their meaning to be obvious at first glance. The earth, however, had preserved them perfectly. They had been sealed for centuries in conditions that allowed metal to survive with astonishing clarity. Bronze objects retained their forms with minimal distortion. Beads remained intact in vast numbers. Layers of soil had protected burial contexts so effectively that even delicate arrangements survived largely undisturbed. It was as if the past had been placed into a sealed container and left untouched until the moment of accidental discovery. The turning point came when more systematic attention was given to these findings. What had initially been treated as isolated curiosities began to be recognized as part of a larger pattern. The objects were not random. They were connected. They belonged to structured contexts, particularly burial environments that indicated intentional placement rather than accidental deposition. This realization marked the beginning of archaeological engagement with the site. When professionals began to investigate the area more carefully, they encountered something that fundamentally changed their understanding of West African history. The complexity of the objects, the sophistication of the metalwork, and the sheer quantity of beads and ritual materials suggested that what lay beneath the soil was not a minor settlement or isolated craft tradition, but a highly developed cultural system. As excavation progressed, the scale of the discovery became increasingly clear. One of the most significant findings was a burial context later associated with the designation, Igbo Richard. Within this burial, archaeologists uncovered an extraordinary concentration of materials, bronze vessels with highly refined decorative patterns, thousands upon thousands of beads, and other objects arranged in a manner that clearly indicated ritual intention. The burial was not simply a grave, it was a carefully constructed assemblage designed to accompany an individual into the next phase of existence according to the belief systems of the society. What made this discovery particularly striking was not only the richness of the materials but the level of craftsmanship they displayed. The bronze objects were not crude or experimental. They demonstrated advanced knowledge of casting techniques, material behavior, and artistic design. The bead assemblages revealed access to long-distance exchange networks that had not been previously fully appreciated in relation to forest region societies of West Africa at such an early period. As researchers studied these materials more closely, it became clear that they represented a civilization that did not fit neatly into existing historical models. At the time of discovery, many assumptions about African history still tended to emphasize either large centralized kingdoms or relatively simple pre-state societies. Igbo-Ukwu challenged both assumptions simultaneously. It showed that highly sophisticated material culture could exist without centralized political structures in the form traditionally expected. The reaction within the academic world was profound. Scholars who examined the materials were confronted with evidence that required significant re-evaluation of established timelines and developmental models. The level of metallurgical sophistication suggested that technological innovation in West Africa had reached advanced stages far earlier than previously assumed. One of the most important figures in bringing this discovery to global attention was Thurston Shaw, whose careful excavation and documentation helped establish Igbo-Ukwu as a major archaeological site of international significance. Through systematic study, recording, and interpretation, the site was transformed from a set of accidental findings into a coherent historical narrative. Yet even as interpretations developed, many aspects of Igbo-Ukwu remained difficult to fully explain. The precise symbolic meanings of many objects are still not completely understood. The full extent of its trade connections remains partially reconstructed rather than definitively mapped. The social organization behind its production, how knowledge was transmitted, who controlled access to materials, and how specialization was structured, continues to be studied and debated. What is clear, however, is that Igbo-Ukwu represents a moment in history where human creativity, ritual imagination, and technical skill converged in a way that left an extraordinary material record. The fact that those actions would one day become history is not something they could have known. And yet, their choices survived in the most durable form possible, material transformation. Bronze does not forget easily. Beads resist decay. Soil preserves what is hidden from disturbance. In this way, the earth became an unintended archive, holding within it a version of human experience that waited silently until another generation was ready to interpret it. When that moment finally came, the past did not return intact. It returned as fragments. Broken contexts. The past was always more complex, more human, and more alive than we were ever taught to expect.